Hello, travelers, and welcome to Adventures in Security, a weekly videocast where we cover practical risk assessments, security tips and tricks, and the news. Today is April 13th, 2014. This is episode 2. Today we're going to talk about Symantec's 2014 Internet Threat Report, and we're going to continue with our practical risk assessment series by looking at part 2. What are the general things that management can decide to do with risk, and therefore what should you be recommending based on certain criteria? So we're going to skip over any news this week, except for Heartbleed, which is the OpenSSL vulnerability that has hopefully been patched by all the major organizations affected by it, including Google, Yahoo, and Facebook. If you haven't changed your passwords for those major websites, do so immediately, because if you've signed into those sites in the last month or so, there's a good chance that your password has been compromised. So make sure that's taken care of. And they're not the only sites. There's sites like Flickr and Instagram that have also been potentially hacked. There are lists of applications that have been affected, and you can see that list at the in the article that's listed now at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's move on to the Internet Security Threat Report for 2014. Now, although it's dated 2014, it's actually covering what happened to us in 2013. But it's a good idea when you look back at 2011, 12, and 13, what the trends are. And these trends seem to be continuing. They don't seem to be abating in any way. So, first of all, Symantec is telling us that 2013 was the year of the mega breach. So what does that mean? That means that although breaches are continuing at a good pace, just like they have in the past, what's happening now is breaches tend to compromise a lot more records at one time than they used to. So let's see what the stats here are. According to Symantec, there were a greater number of breaches. In 2013, there were 62% more breaches than in 2012. However, 8 of the breaches in 2013 exposed more than 10 million identities each. In 2012, only 1 breach exposed over 10 million identities. And although 2011 was a little bit worse than 2012, 5 exceeded that number. So in 2013, a total of 552 million identities were potentially compromised. Now, this does not tell us how many of our identities were taken 2 or 3 times. I can tell you mine has been in the past. The Veterans Administration has not had a good history of protecting my information. And this information includes birth dates, government ID numbers, home addresses, medical records, phone numbers, financial information, email addresses, login, passwords, and other information, including information into your criminal background, assuming you have one. So, while targeted attacks continue to grow, there's also a large growth in watering hole attacks. That is, when you go to a website and all of a sudden it's like a drive-by, you get infected. So spear phishing attacks rose 91% in frequency in 2013, and they also run 3 times longer. So they must be effective in some way. Probably because they're just wearing down the users, or the users are trying to find a user on a bad day. So these attacks are growing in frequency, and they last a lot longer. Waiting for your boss to come in on a day when he or she hasn't had enough coffee and forgets that they shouldn't be clicking on everything that they see. And something surprising to me, while most targeted attacks in 2013 were against government and the service industry, the number one attack target is mining. Mining, the odds of being attacked is 1 in 2.7. Government is 1 in 3.1. And manufacturing has a chance of being targeted, a 1 in 3.2 chance of being targeted. The attacks are continuing, and they're getting more frequent, and they're lasting in duration. So in many cases, you're going to find that there probably are going to be more there are probably more advanced persistent threats against your organizations as we begin to really solidify our security frameworks. And that's something to keep in mind. And along those lines, we have the most vulnerable issue are zero-day attacks. Now, zero-day attacks are also increasing. More were discovered in 2013 than in any other year ever covered by Symantec. And this is primarily caused, these kinds of attacks against our users. And remember, there's a lot of drive-by attacks now, watering hole attacks. But the legitimate websites with poor patch management have facilitated the adoption of watering hole attacks. So, and what Symantec found was, and I quote, 77% of legitimate websites had exploitable vulnerabilities, and 1 in 8 of all websites had a critical vulnerability. So while we have a reasonable expectation that the places that we visit are doing what they can to protect us, this is usually not the case. So it's very important that in our personal browsing that we're careful what we do. And it's also important that we manage where our users go when they're in the office. And another important statistic about this is even though the top 5 zero-day vulnerabilities were patched on average within 4 days, Symantec detected a total of 174,000 attacks within 30 days of these top 5 becoming known. So, how long does it take you to apply a critical patch? And why is every critical patch that comes out critical for your organization? These are things that we will talk about when we talk about risk assessments. Not everything that comes out is critical to your organization. And if you are a website hosting organization, hosting a website for anyone, for any reason, make sure that you're patching as quickly as you can. You owe it to your customers and to your business partners. If you're not patching, make sure that they understand your patch schedule so that they can take steps to help protect themselves. A lot of organizations aren't going to want to do this because they'd like to keep it secret. Well, time for secrecy on these things is over. We have to rely on the users themselves to help protect themselves and us. So we need to work with them to make sure that everybody's got the information they need about potential risk. So now we hit ransomware attacks. Ransomware attacks grew by 500% in 2013. And not only were victims' files encrypted, but any network drive to which they were attached would also have its files encrypted. So this isn't a new thing, as Symantec says, but because they're using Bitcoin increasingly to get organizations to pay the ransoms, these attacks are growing rapidly with with things using things like ransomware, commonly known as CryptoLocker. One still frightening thing is that the prevalence of scams, and users all know about these, and so do organizations, they fail to change user behavior on social media. Fake offers such as free cell phone minutes accounted for the largest number of attacks of Facebook users in 2013, 81% in 2013 compared to 56% in 2012. So the users still aren't getting it. If you're allowing your users to use social media at the office or to use social media while using your business-owned equipment and software, you're probably not practicing due diligence. There's no reason for them to be on the social networks when they're at the office unless you're using them for business. Now, I worked for a company that used Twitter to communicate with across its different departments. If you do that, then you have to make sure all your other controls are in place. Something that's growing now is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things consists of devices in your home or business that are not actually what we consider computers traditionally. They are computers, they are processing capabilities within refrigerators, within coffee pots, within just about anything that's coming out now is increasingly going to include computers. And the Internet of Things becomes a reality as these things start to get plugged in to our home or business networks. Now, even though they themselves probably don't contain any sensitive information, they can be set up as bots for botnets or be used as launching platforms to attack other resources in your network. The important thing here is that the things that we're talking about are manufactured by vendors who really have little or no attention paid to security, because why? It's not a computer. Nobody's browsing the internet with it. These are things that we need to start consider. There are questions we need to start asking before we plug in any computerized device of any kind into our network. And this is especially true with control systems. For more information on how control systems might be compromised or how allowing access to control systems might elevate your risk, take a look at the article link shown below. So last week, we talked about risk. We defined risk. We looked at multiple risk formulas that we can use to determine how much risk is present for a specific system. Now, a system, remember, is like payroll is a system, and that includes all devices necessary for us to run payroll processes. Human resources system, that's a systems too. So when we talk about systems, when I talk about systems, unless I actually say machine or something of that nature, when I say system, I'm talking about all the devices and software connected that are necessary to perform a specific business task or a set of related business system processes. So this week we're going to talk about how we manage risk. We're going to do this at a high level. Then next week we're going to start digging deeper into each of the risk components, and this will be followed by a series of casts on how to apply a practical risk assessment using a tool that I will be providing to you. And again, the whole purpose of this risk assessment book that I'm writing and these videocast segments that are going to be from that book are to help you quickly put together a risk assessment when a patch comes out or when you're putting in new equipment, or when you just want to do an annual assessment for something that you haven't done an assessment for in a long time, and you want to be able to do this quickly, efficiently, and without management breathing down your neck trying to get you to do something else. Okay, managing risk. Okay, as a security professionals, it's our responsibility to conduct regular risk assessments. So when I just mentioned sometimes when you're going to do a risk assessment, and that the result of those risk assessments are going to be measures of risk. Now, everything I'm going to talk about in risk has to do with qualitative risk assessments, which means you're using your experience, the experience of others that are involved in the assessment, to help you come to some kind of a score, a risk score. And the tool that I'll be providing helps you get there. And I prefer this method to quantitative risk assessments where we come up with dollars, because most organizations don't have the dollars calculated for business impact, which is your risk. So asking them to do that when they have so many other things to do elevates their opportunity cost to a point where they tend to blow you off. So you're better off to do qualitative assessments, train everyone, all your stakeholders, on how to do qualitative, how to provide input to qualitative assessments, and then use those instead. So when we find risk, we can recommend to management 4 different things that they can do. The first thing is they can avoid risk. Avoiding risk means that they just don't do what they're planning to do. Well, this doesn't go over so well most of the time. In my years as a security director, I think twice I was able to get management to move from their position on actually implementing something new. What happened was they came up with for example, they came up with a way to transfer data in a new way that was not secure. They were doing this to the bank, and it wasn't necessary. It was just a little more efficient for the operators. But when we looked at it, the risk was very high. When we found out that the value of doing this was much lower than the risk, even with any additional controls, management decided not to go down that road. This is avoidance of risk. Management can accept risk. So it's management's decision as to whether the risk that you present to them outweighs the value of making the change or implementing the new system that they want to implement. So when they do this, when they accept the risk because they consider the risk to be lower than the value, this is risk acceptance. They can decide to mitigate risk. Mitigating risk is the process of taking steps to either increase your controls and to eliminate vulnerabilities, or to mitigate your threat landscape. So let's talk about these for a minute. We can manage threats, which we can't eliminate them at the source. What we can do is eliminate the number of threats that can get to a specific resource. So we call this the threat universe. The threat universe is the number of threats that can actually get to a resource. So the threat universe will vary by resource, by where it is located on the network, and how well and what controls exist to block any traffic to that resource. So for example, if we put a resource on a restricted network segment and we set that network segment up as a security zone, and we put up high walls so that very little traffic can get to that resource, we have minimized the threat universe for that resource. So that's one of the best ways to manage threats. We can also remove vulnerabilities. On the screen right now is a list of vulnerability types. These are the things that we should be addressing. Notice the first one is configurations. We tend sometimes to not configure things correctly according to vendor or standards of best practice recommendations, leaving holes in our systems. Proper configuration can remove vulnerabilities. Patching removes vulnerabilities. Addressing each one of these things listed will help remove vulnerabilities. Anything we can do to reduce an attack surface will help not only with vulnerabilities, but it also helps with the threat universe. For more information on attack surfaces, what they are, and how to mitigate them, see the link on the screen. Another thing we can do to reduce risk is reduce business impact. Business impact is your actual dollar and cent risk, whether it's represented as a qualitative number or whether it's represented as dollars and cents. So we mitigate risk by determining how we can mitigate business impact when an incident occurs. One of the best ways to do this is to have a documented, well-practiced incident response process. We can implement more controls, or we can use the controls that we have more efficiently. Part of a risk assessment is creating an attack tree and tracing possible attack routes from the threat source to the target. This will help us to identify where we can place choke points that not only affect that resource, but also affect a set of resources, which is the most efficient way for us to apply controls. So, for example, a perimeter firewall blocks all but allowed ingress traffic. Network and system IPS solutions block all anomalous traffic. Access control lists on switches regulate access to each network segment. This set of controls reduces the threat universe. Another example, log aggravation and correlation helps identify potential attacks in real time. An existing and practiced incident response process allows security to quickly identify the threat, contain it, eradicate it, and return operations to normal. These things represent a reduction in business impact. A strong patch management program enables patching of servers, end user, and network devices. Vulnerability management, beginning with resource scanning, helps identify vulnerabilities with high severity. It ends with configuration changes or patch management to remove or mitigate the weakness. This represents a reduction in vulnerabilities. So if we choose not to accept risk or avoid it, accept it, or mitigate it, we can also transfer it. Now, there seems to be some confusion about what transferring risk actually means. We cannot transfer responsibility, our financial impact, to another entity unless that other entity is willing to take on the financial responsibility. Cloud service providers are typically not willing to take on any kind of financial liability for a security incident. So that is not transferring risk to move your stuff up to a cloud service provider and move the risk there as well. It's still your risk. Transferring risk has to do, again, with moving business impact, the financial impact on your business, to someone else, like an insurance company. So you can buy insurance like business interruption insurance, and that is transferring some of your risk for like a DDoS attack or loss of access to systems because of a disaster. So let's summarize what we covered last week and this week, which constitutes Chapter 1 in my book. Risk management is security management. This is an important point. They're not different. Managing security is about managing risk for the business. We don't throw controls at things just to block them out. We must always take into account operational efficiency before we start tweaking our security framework. As security professionals, we help system and data owners understand existing risks, and we recommend to them ways that they can mitigate the risk. This means we have to have a good understanding of the organizations for which we work. It's very important that we understand the appetite for risk of the organization. And it's very important that we use good cost-benefit analysis techniques, which we will also go into later in this series. And this is not complicated. You don't have to be an accountant. It's very easy to take a look and say, okay, this is how I'm going to present this to management. This is the cost. This is the cost of the controls. This is how I'm going to mitigate the risk. And this is the risk versus the value of the change that the business is making. Management understands this. And if you show that you understand management's viewpoints, then it's going to go a long way to getting you what you need to help protect the business. Managers can decide to avoid, accept, mitigate, or transfer risk. And again, remember, transferring risk has nothing to do with moving your stuff someplace else and assuming that, man, they got the risk now. That's not what it means. There are times when you should be recommending that maybe something doesn't happen. A change does not occur because the risk is too high. But use that sparingly. You don't want to be walking into meetings saying, no, we can't do this. Our jobs are to get to yes. How do we enable the business to do things that it needs to do, but do them safely? So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to start looking in depth at threats, and we'll take another look at the news and see what's been going on out there. Hopefully, Heartbleed will be under control, and everyone has changed their passwords like they're supposed to. So to that end, again, here's the link to an article that provides a list of a large number of commonly used websites and whether or not you need to change your password for those sites. So until then, be careful what you click.